Imagine being wrongfully arrested, face down on the ground, all because of your skin color. But what happens next will shock you, because in just 2 minutes, the tables turn in the most unexpected way. Stick around to see how justice unfolds. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to never miss a powerful story like this. You people are always causing trouble. That was the first thing Officer Daniels said when he pulled over a sleek black SUV on the outskirts of a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood in Virginia, late one Tuesday afternoon. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, painting the streets gold, but the tension in the air was anything but calm. The man behind the wheel, dressed sharply in a tailored gray suit with a black tie and polished shoes, raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. His name was Michael Turner, a highly respected FBI special agent with over 10 years of service in the Bureau. He had taken down drug rings, investigated federal corruption, and earned commendations most cops could only dream about. But right now, none of that mattered. Not to Officer Daniels, who had already decided who Michael was before a word had even been spoken. Without identifying himself or stating the reason for the stop, Daniels stepped up to the car window, his stance wide and confrontational. "License and registration." "Now," he barked. No, hello, no professional courtesy, just cold assumption wrapped in authority. Michael remained calm, his hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" His tone was firm but polite, clear but not combative. To someone trained in law enforcement, it was the kind of response that should have de-escalated things, but Daniels wasn't having it. "Don't play smart with me," he snapped, his hand already drifting dangerously close to the weapon on his hip. "You were driving suspiciously slow. Either give me your ID, or I'll take you out of the car myself." Michael knew this wasn't about driving. It wasn't about any traffic violation. This was personal. It was profiling. Still, he wanted to keep the situation from spiraling. "Officer, I am a federal agent. My credentials are in my jacket pocket. I will reach for them slowly, with your permission." But instead of easing up, Daniels's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. Step out of the car." His voice rose, and within seconds the car door was yanked open, and Turner was being forcibly pulled from the vehicle. With surprising aggression, Daniels shoved him against the hood of the SUV, cuffing him roughly while shouting commands that Turner was already following. "Stop resisting. Hands behind your back." Turner didn't resist. He never had. But in Daniels' eyes, compliance didn't matter. A man like Turner, dressed well, driving a nice vehicle, and with dark skin in a white neighborhood, that was enough. Neighbors began to gather, phones pointed at the unfolding scene. Some whispered, others recorded, but no one intervened. On the ground, Turner tried again. "I am an FBI agent. You're making a serious mistake." But Daniels laughed, mocking him. "Oh, an FBI agent? What's next, CIA? Superman?" Turner bit his tongue, not out of fear, but out of discipline. He knew backup would arrive soon, and when it did, the truth would be impossible to ignore. And just 2 minutes later, it happened. A black government SUV rolled up behind the police cruiser, and out stepped Special Agent Lisa Monroe, one of Turner's colleagues, and a fierce presence in her own right. With her badge held high and her voice sharp, she approached the scene, like a storm. "Officer, release that man immediately. He is a federal agent." Daniels froze, stunned. "Wait, what?" His arrogance drained from his face like color. "He didn't tell me that." Monroe was unmoved. "He did. Multiple times. You ignored it. You assaulted a federal officer and unlawfully detained him." She crouched beside Turner, unfastened the cuffs, and helped him to his feet as more. Bureau agents began arriving in black vehicles, one after the other, forming a line behind her. Daniels tried to recover. "I thought he was lying. He didn't look..." But he caught himself, realizing the hole he was digging. He didn't act like an agent. Monroe stared him down. "What does an agent look like to you, officer? Daniels?" There was silence. And in that silence, the damage spoke louder than any defense ever could. A senior field supervisor stepped forward and took over the scene. Daniels was disarmed on the spot and in a twist of poetic justice placed in handcuffs himself, this time by the very people he had disrespected. He tried to protest, stumbling through excuses. He was being suspicious. I didn't know. I thought. But none of it mattered now. The recordings from bystanders were already online, racking up views and shares. In just hours, the video of the incident went viral across social media, news outlets picked it up, and the conversation lit up. How could a trained police officer ignore clear identification and detain a federal agent simply because of how he looked? The answer was ugly, but real. Racial profiling doesn't stop at the border of authority. It seeps through the cracks of every institution. Even federal agents aren't immune. Turner, though bruised and angry, never raised his voice, never broke composure, and never let the incident turn him into the aggressor. He later gave a statement to the press, not to condemn law enforcement, but to shine a light on the systemic issues that led to his mistreatment. I wear a badge just like that officer did, he said, but some people don't see the badge. They just see the color of your skin. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. His words struck a nerve, sparking a renewed conversation about reform, accountability, and the need for better training in recognizing unconscious bias. Daniels was suspended pending investigation and eventually faced formal charges, including unlawful detention, excessive use of force, and misconduct under color of law. Meanwhile, Turner continued his work, even using the incident as a teaching moment during FBI internal seminars on bias awareness. For him, the moment wasn't just about justice, it was about creating change, about making sure that the next black agent or black citizen isn't forced to prove their humanity before they can speak. And while the sting of humiliation and bruises from that day remained, Turner walked taller, knowing he had exposed something that needed to be seen. Because sometimes, the most powerful badge isn't the one you wear, it's the truth you carry, and the strength to stand with dignity when others try to take it away. Turner could feel the tension thickening like fog. He'd been in high-pressure situations before, undercover stings, armed raids, face-to-face with dangerous criminals, but nothing about those moments prepared him for the quiet hostility radiating from the uniformed man standing just outside his SUV. The way Officer Daniels gripped his holster, the squint in his eyes, the instant suspicion in his voice. It was all too familiar, not as an FBI agent, but as a black man in America. The street was empty, save for a few houses with blinds slightly parted, and the suburban calm only made the moment feel more surreal. "Step out of the car," Daniels suddenly barked, his hand now fully resting on his sidearm. Turner remained composed. His voice didn't shake, and his hands didn't tremble. He placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel in full view, and said in a measured tone, "Officer, I am a federal agent. My credentials are in my jacket pocket. I'd like to retrieve them slowly with your permission." That should have ended it. It should have diffused everything, flipped a mental switch, triggered some recognition of process and authority. But it didn't. It only enraged Daniels more. "Out of the car!" he shouted again, and before Turner could respond, Daniels lunged forward, yanked open the driver's side door, and without warning, grabbed Turner by the arm, pulling him violently from the seat. Turner's head smacked the edge of the doorframe before he was thrown onto the pavement face first. His body hit the concrete with a sickening thud, the kind that echoes not just in the ears but in the soul. Still, Turner didn't resist. He knew better. He had seen far too many body cams, too many autopsy photos, too many grieving families to make a single wrong move. "You're making a mistake," he said into the sidewalk, his cheeks scraped and bleeding slightly. "I'm an FBI agent." But Daniels wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too deep in his own power trip. "Yeah, right, and I'm the president," he sneered, forcing Turner's arms behind his back and locking the handcuffs tighter than necessary. In that moment, Turner wasn't a respected federal officer. He wasn't a man who'd risked his life tracking down cartel operatives and dismantling domestic terror plots. He was just another suspect in the eyes of a small-town cop with a dangerous ego and unchecked bias. Neighbors began to gather at a distance, some peeking through windows, others stepping out quietly with phones in hand, capturing every frame. Daniels continued shouting, loud enough to justify the use of force to any future review board. "Stop resisting. Keep your hands where I can see them." Even though Turner hadn't moved, hadn't protested, hadn't even raised his voice, he lay there on the ground, calm on the outside, boiling on the inside. He wasn't humiliated because of the handcuffs or the rough handling. He was humiliated because he knew this wasn't new. It was just his turn. Minutes passed like hours, and just when it seemed things might get worse, a black SUV rolled up quietly behind the squad car. Out stepped Special Agent Lisa Monroe, badge in hand, eyes locked on the scene in front of her. She moved quickly, assertively, with the full authority of someone who knew exactly what she was walking into. "What's going on here?" she asked.
Sharply. Daniels turned, confused by the interruption. "Stay back, ma'am. This is a police matter." But Monroe wasn't some civilian. She flipped open her badge wallet and raised her voice.
"I'm Special Agent Monroe with the FBI. That man you've got cuffed on the ground is Agent Michael Turner, one of ours. Release him, now." The silence that followed was electric. Daniels stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without words. "He said he was FBI," he stammered. "I didn't believe him." "He identified himself multiple times," Monroe shot back, walking past him and kneeling beside Turner. "And you ignored him. You assaulted a federal agent." She unlocked the cuffs gently and helped Turner sit up, examining his face with a glance. "You okay?" Turner nodded slightly, the cut on his cheek still bleeding. By now, more vehicles had arrived. Government plates, blacked-out windows, a swarm of suits stepping out with grim expressions and quick strides. Daniels looked around, realizing too late what was unfolding. His arrogance evaporated, replaced with disbelief and panic. His commanding officer, who had just arrived and been briefed, walked up and said bluntly, "You're done. Badge. Gun. Now." Daniels tried to explain, voice cracking. He didn't act like an agent. He was being suspicious, but every word only tightened the noose. "What does an agent look like to you?" Monroe asked again, this time loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Daniels had no answer. Turner stood slowly, stretching his arms, wiping blood from his jaw. He said nothing to Daniels. There was nothing left to say. In the hours that followed, everything moved quickly. Daniels was placed on administrative leave, Internal Affairs opened an investigation, and the bystander footage spread online like wildfire. Twitter, YouTube, national news, all lit up with the same headline. "Cop detains black FBI agent, ends up in handcuffs himself." The comments poured in. Some were supportive, many were angry. A few, of course, tried to defend the officer's actions, but the footage made it hard to deny what had happened. This wasn't a mistake. This was a symptom. At the press conference held 2 days later, Turner stood in front of cameras and said, "This isn't about one bad officer. It's about a system where bias overrides judgment, where appearance outweighs facts. I told him who I was. He chose not to believe me. That choice wasn't about law. It was about prejudice." The room was silent as he spoke. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashed, and Monroe stood just behind him, proud but solemn. Turner didn't demand revenge. He asked for reform, real reform. He talked about federal and local partnerships, better training, psychological evaluations, accountability systems that worked not just in policy, but in practice. And while Daniels awaited disciplinary action and possible prosecution for assaulting a federal officer, Turner returned to work. He didn't carry bitterness. He carried resolve. He began leading workshops on bias recognition within the Bureau. He used his story not to highlight his pain, but to spark change. Because even with a badge, even with rank and respect, he had been reduced in a matter of seconds to something far too many people experience daily. A threat, judged by skin, not by actions. And while that day on the pavement would never leave his memory, he chose to make it mean something more. He chose to turn humiliation into action, injustice into momentum. Because in the end, strength isn't just surviving the blow, It's rising with purpose after it lands. Just 2 minutes after Turner was forced to the ground, a black SUV pulled up silently behind the police cruiser, its tires barely making a sound on the quiet suburban road. Out stepped a tall woman, dressed in a black blazer and sleek sunglasses that obscured her sharp gaze. She didn't rush, but every step was purposeful, her body language exuding authority. Before she even reached the scene, she had already pulled her badge from inside her jacket and held it up for Daniels to see. "I'm Special Agent Lisa Monroe with the FBI," she said, her voice firm, clear, and unwavering. "You're detaining one of our agents, illegally." Officer Daniels froze, blinking in confusion, the weight of the situation suddenly hitting him like a ton of bricks. He glanced down at Turner, still lying on the ground, his face pressed against the pavement, and stammered, "What? No, this can't be. He said he was FBI, but I didn't believe him." The confusion on his face quickly turned to panic as Monroe walked past him with barely a glance. She didn't wait for his explanation. She didn't need to. She had already seen enough. She reached Turner's side in 2 swift strides, crouched down, and gently helped him to his feet. Turner's wrists were red and swollen, the bruises already starting to form from the rough way Daniels had handled him. His suit was torn in places, his face smeared with dirt and blood. Turner didn't react with anger or frustration. He had seen much worse in his career, but the bruises told a story of injustice, and Monroe's expression hardened as she saw them. "You're in serious trouble, officer," she said coldly, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. "You just assaulted a federal officer during the performance of his duties." Daniel stood there trying to process what was happening, but his words were tumbling out of his mouth in a panicked mess. He didn't look like an agent. He didn't act like one. He mumbled, trying to justify his actions, but his voice trailed off as he saw Monroe's unwavering gaze locked on him. Turner said nothing, but his eyes, those calm, unshaken eyes, spoke volumes. Turner had remained composed throughout the ordeal, never once raising his voice or struggling. He knew the risks of doing anything that could be perceived as resistance. He had seen it all too many times. The man who tried to fight back, the woman who raised her voice, the teen who dared to make a move. How quickly that could escalate into tragedy. He had been in the game long enough to know that no matter the authority you held, the color of your skin was often what dictated how you were treated. And so, when the officer yanked him from the car, slammed him into the ground, and mocked him, Turner knew this wasn't just a mistake. This was profiling. This was something far worse. But now, standing in front of him, Special Agent Monroe was like a beacon of hope in a storm. Her unwavering professionalism and quick action were the contrast to Daniels' reckless aggression. Still, as Monroe stood in front of him, Daniels was not ready to give up. He tried again, his voice shaking. "I didn't know he was FBI. He didn't look like an agent. I've seen guys like him before. He was acting suspicious." It was the same tired excuse, the one that was used over and over again to justify these types of interactions. Turner was tired of hearing it. Acting suspicious wasn't a valid reason for mistreatment. It was an excuse to carry out prejudice. Turner took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and said nothing to Daniels. But Agent Monroe was done listening. "That's enough," she snapped, pulling out her radio. She pressed the button and called it in, her voice steady and sharp. "We have a situation. Officer Daniels has detained a federal agent without cause. I need backup immediately." The words hung in the air, and in that moment, the situation shifted entirely. It was no longer just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It was an officer abusing his power, and now the system was going to hold him accountable. The police officers on scene, who had arrived earlier as backup for Daniels, now looked at each other uneasily. Some seemed uncomfortable with what had transpired, while others stood there, silent, realizing they might be witnesses to something bigger. Monroe's cold stare never wavered as she continued. "Officer Daniels, you are in violation of federal law. You've just assaulted a federal agent, and I'm placing you under arrest." The words seemed to hit Daniels like a slap in the face. His confusion turned to panic and he stumbled back, trying to make sense of everything that had happened so quickly. No, this isn't right." Daniels muttered, his voice shaky. "I'm a cop. I was just doing my job. He was acting strange." Monroe ignored him, her eyes locked on Turner, making sure he was unharmed. She knew what had to be done now. With a flick of her wrist, she signaled for 2 other agents to step forward. They moved quickly, disarming Daniels, pulling his gun from his holster, and taking his badge with swift efficiency. It was almost as though it were all part of a well-rehearsed script. And in a sense, it was. This was a system built to protect, to investigate, and to hold those in positions of power accountable when they crossed the line. Monroe motioned for Turner to step aside as Daniels was pushed roughly against the hood of his own cruiser, his hands cuffed behind his back. His once proud, shiny badge now seemed like a distant memory. Turner looked on, not with satisfaction or relief, but with quiet dignity. He had no need to say anything more to Daniels. The consequences of the officer's actions were already unfolding before his eyes. "You don't understand, do you?" Monroe said, her voice low but filled with authority. "You don't get to make that choice for someone else. Not when it comes to their humanity. Not when it comes to their rights." Daniels remained silent, his head hanging in defeat as he realized the full extent of his error. Turner knew the whole thing wasn't over. This moment wasn't the end, but a beginning. Monroe and the other agents swiftly started documenting the scene, speaking to witnesses, and taking the necessary steps to ensure the investigation moved forward. Turner, though exhausted and battered, stood tall. He wasn't just a victim of this moment. He was a part of something much larger, something that would make a difference long after this day. The world would hear about Officer Daniels' actions. His badge would be taken, his reputation tarnished, and his future in law enforcement erased. But it wouldn't stop there. Turner knew the public would demand more than just a consequence for Daniels. They would demand reform. They would demand answers. As the scene began to clear and Monroe took control of the situation, Turner turned his gaze to the nearby houses. Neighbors who had watched, some with cameras in hand, others simply in disbelief, would carry this moment with them forever. His story would become their story, and together, they would demand that something like this never happened again. This wasn't just one cop's failure. It was a broken system, and they were all witnesses to it. As Turner and Monroe walked away from the scene, they knew they had done more than just stop an officer from abusing his power. They had exposed a flaw, a crack in the system that needed to be fixed. And just like that, with each step forward, they were changing the narrative. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. In a matter of minutes, more vehicles arrived. FBI response teams, supervisors, and internal affairs. Officer Daniels stood there, suddenly the most nervous man on the street. His posture, once rigid with authority, now crumbled as the realization of his mistake set in. His badge was taken, his weapon removed, and the very same handcuffs that he had just moments ago slapped onto Turner's wrists were now clamped onto his own. The irony was not lost on the growing crowd of onlookers, some of whom watched in stunned silence while others quietly clapped, unsure of how else to express their quiet relief. Daniels, now visibly shaken, tried to defend his actions, his voice trembling with disbelief. "He was being suspicious," he said, his words barely audible. "I didn't know." But it was too late for excuses. His words only seemed to make everything worse. Agent Monroe, standing tall and unshaken beside him, looked at him coldly, her gaze piercing through the remnants of his bravado. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," she responded sharply. "You let your bias make the decisions for you, and now you'll face the consequences." The words hung in the air, powerful and final, carrying the weight of truth. Turner, still standing in the background, silently observed the unfolding scene. He had always known the law, the system, was supposed to protect him. But standing there now, watching as Officer Daniels, the man who had just minutes ago violated his rights, was now the one being arrested. It felt like a small, but necessary, victory. The system for once was working as it should. Accountability was being handed down, and justice was moving, even if it was only a small step forward. Turner didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was a testament to his strength, his restraint. He had been through too many instances like this to count, each one a reminder of the harsh truths he faced as a black man in law enforcement. But this time, the script had flipped. The same law that had failed him time and again, the same rules that had been manipulated to target him, were now being used to hold Daniels accountable for his actions. The crowd that had gathered around seemed to recognize the significance of the moment. It wasn't just about Turner, and it wasn't just about Daniels. This was a larger moment, a chance to confront the biases that still seeped into every corner of the system, a chance to start demanding real change. The officers from Internal Affairs moved quickly, taking charge of the situation, documenting everything with cold efficiency. Their presence was both a reminder of the weight of the moment and an assurance that the situation would be investigated thoroughly. Meanwhile, the onlookers murmured among themselves, some in quiet disbelief, others in palpable anger. The injustice that had unfolded just moments before was still fresh in their minds. They knew what they had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just one bad apple in a sea of good cops. It was a system that had allowed officers like Daniels to exist, to thrive, and to act with impunity. Turner, however, didn't focus on the crowd or the attention. He wasn't there to be a symbol. He wasn't looking for a round of applause or for his story to be the latest viral sensation. He had been through too much in his life to allow himself to bask in the moment. What mattered, what truly mattered, was that the truth had been exposed. Officer Daniels, for all his authority, for all his bravado, had been caught in a lie. His actions had been exposed for what they were: bias in action, discrimination in uniform. And now, there would be consequences. The irony was sharp. For so long, Turner had been the one subjected to suspicion, to profiling, to the assumption that he was a threat simply because of the color of his skin. He had seen it in the eyes of suspects, in the eyes of his own colleagues, in the eyes of civilians. But now, those roles had reversed. Now, Turner stood on the other side, not as a suspect, not as a target, but as an agent of the law. And Daniels, the officer who had assumed the worst of him, the officer who had violated his rights, was now the one being detained. Daniels, no longer the figure of authority, was nothing more than a man caught in his own web of lies. Turner took a deep breath, the weight of the situation still heavy in his chest. He knew the battle wasn't over. What had happened today, this moment of accountability, was just one small victory in a much larger fight. But it was a victory nonetheless. In the coming days, as the investigation unfolded and the media caught wind of the incident, Turner's story would become part of a much larger conversation. It would be a conversation about the racial biases that still permeated law enforcement, about the need for reform, about the importance of ensuring that officers like Daniels were held accountable. And Turner, though he had lived through the trauma, the mistreatment, the humiliation, was now determined to make sure that others wouldn't have to endure what he had. His role as an FBI agent had always been more than just a job. It had been a calling, a way to bring justice, to protect and serve. But now, it was also a platform to speak out against the very systems that had wronged him, to call for change, and to inspire those who had been silenced for too long. The pain, the anger, the frustration that had built up over years of inequality, of racial profiling, was still there, but it wasn't consuming him. He had learned to channel it, to use it as fuel, to turn his experience into a movement. As the scene began to calm and the officers from Internal Affairs started questioning Daniels, Turner turned to Agent Monroe, who had remained by his side throughout the ordeal. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything they had just witnessed. But there was something else there, too, a sense of purpose. "You did good today," Turner said quietly. Monroe nodded, but there was no joy in her expression. She had seen these kinds of situations play out too many times, and she knew this was just the beginning. "We did good," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "But it's only the start." Turner didn't disagree. The road ahead was long, but today had shown him that change was possible, and as the two of them walked away from the scene, the noise of the crowd and the flashing lights fading in the distance, Turner knew that this moment, this small but significant moment, was one step closer to the larger goal. A goal where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. A goal where every person, regardless of their skin color, could feel safe knowing that the law would protect them, not judge them. As they walked, Turner's thoughts turned to the future, to the workshops he would lead, the conversations he would start, the changes he would fight for. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The work ahead would be long and difficult, but today, Turner felt a sense of hope that had eluded him for far too long. Officer Daniels was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and soon after, he was charged with assault, false detainment, and abuse of power. The news sent shockwaves through the community, but the real storm started when video footage of the incident, captured by bystanders, went viral. The footage, showing the blatant disregard for Turner's rights and the officer's aggression, sparked national outrage. Social media exploded, with people across the country demanding justice not just for Turner, but for everyone who had ever faced the harsh reality of racial profiling. The video became a conversation starter for many, about racial bias, discrimination, and how systemic issues can affect everyone, even those within law enforcement itself. Special Agent Turner, although shaken by the events he had endured, used the moment to fuel his fight for change. Rather than retreat, he chose to return to work with renewed purpose. He had always been dedicated to his job, but now, his role as an FBI agent became something more than just a career. It was a platform, a tool to spread awareness. Turner didn't seek to be a martyr or to turn his ordeal into a spectacle. He wanted to make real change, and he knew that the best way to do so was by sharing his story and teaching others the lessons he had learned the hard way. He led internal training for his colleagues on implicit bias, explaining how even the most well-intentioned individuals could fall prey to preconceived notions that affected their actions, whether they were aware of it or not. He worked tirelessly to educate his fellow agents on how to handle confrontations lawfully, respectfully, and above all, humanely. Turner's message was simple but powerful. I wear a badge, but I also wear skin that gets judged before words are even spoken. It was a message that resonated deeply, not just within the FBI but beyond the agency. Turner had become a voice for those who felt unheard, for those who had been dismissed, ignored, or worse, abused. His story was one of strength, perseverance, and unwavering dignity. Despite everything that had happened, he had maintained his calm under pressure, choosing to remain composed even when the situation seemed unbearable. It was this restraint, this dignity in the face of utter disrespect, that turned the tide for him. He had shown the world that the way to overcome injustice wasn't through anger or violence. It was through poise, patience, and the relentless pursuit of accountability. The incident, however traumatic, had proven one undeniable fact. The IQ system hadn't failed him that day. It had worked. But it had only worked because Turner knew how to make it work. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was effective. By standing firm, by using the law as a shield and not as a weapon, he had created the space needed for the truth to come forward. The story of Officer Daniels, on the other hand, was a tale of consequences, lessons learned the hard way. As the investigation proceeded, Daniels tried to defend himself, offering up the same tired excuses that many officers in his position had given in the past. He claimed he had been under pressure, that he had feared for his safety, that Turner had made him feel threatened, but those excuses didn't hold up under scrutiny. The video evidence told a different story, one of an officer who had acted on his biases, who had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. Daniels had not acted out of self-defense. He had acted out of prejudice, allowing his skin-deep assumptions about Turner to dictate his actions. And in doing so, he had broken the law. Officer Daniels' once proud badge now meant nothing. He was placed on leave, and eventually the charges against him were enough to make his career in law enforcement come to a sudden, crashing halt. He was no longer the officer in control. He was the man in cuffs, being led away in shame. But even as his life and career crumbled, the real message of the case was not about his downfall. It was about the change that followed. Turner's resilience, his quiet strength, had turned what could have been a painful, demeaning experience into a catalyst for change. The media coverage of the incident sparked renewed conversations across the country about racial profiling, and the way black individuals, particularly those in law enforcement, were treated by their peers. The conversation about reform gained momentum. Protesters took to the streets, demanding that law enforcement agencies take a hard look at their practices and adopt policies that would prevent this kind of injustice from happening again. Community leaders spoke out, urging everyone from civilians to law enforcement to examine their own biases and work towards building a system that protected everyone equally. Turner became a symbol of this movement. His story was shared across news outlets, on social media platforms, and even in the halls of Congress. His voice became a powerful tool in advocating for reforms, not just within the FBI, but within law enforcement agencies nationwide. But Turner was never interested in fame or accolades. He wasn't looking for praise for simply doing his job. For him, it was never about the recognition. It was about ensuring that future generations didn't have to fight the same battles. It was about creating a world where no one, regardless of their race or background, would ever have to face what he had. As time went on, Turner's work began to pay off. He was invited to lead national forums on racial bias in policing, working alongside experts, lawmakers, and community leaders to address the root causes of profiling and discrimination. His experience gave him a unique perspective, one that allowed him to speak with authority on the topic. Turner used his voice to push for lasting change, advocating for better training for police officers, for clearer guidelines on how to handle situations like the one he had endured, and for a complete overhaul of the ways that law enforcement agencies dealt with issues of race and discrimination. He pushed for more diversity within police departments, more community outreach programs, and more accountability for officers who crossed the line. But Turner didn't stop there. He also worked to bring about internal change within the FBI, ensuring that his agency, too, would be held accountable for its own flaws. His leadership and dedication earned him respect from both his colleagues and the broader law enforcement community. Yet despite all the recognition, Turner never lost sight of the larger goal: justice for all. And as for Officer Daniels, his downfall was not a triumph for Turner, but a cautionary tale. Daniels learned the hard way that justice in America, no matter how delayed, was not blind to abuse, especially when it came from those who were sworn to protect and serve. His career was over, his reputation in tatters, but more importantly, the message was clear. No one was above the law. Not even those who wore badges. Turner's story wasn't one of retribution, it was one of redemption, both for him and for the system that had failed him in the past. It was proof that even in the face of injustice, dignity, strength, and the pursuit of accountability could turn the tide. In the end, justice had been served, and Turner's legacy would be one of progress, not just for his own career, but for the future of law enforcement and the communities they served. Wow, what a journey. Justice may take time, but in the end, it always finds its way. If you are moved by this story and want to see more powerful moments like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and remember, real change starts with awareness.